Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Brandon Rood, the Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and one of the curators, along with Corey Piper at the Chrysler Museum of Art, of the exhibitions Americans in Spain. I want to thank everyone for attending this evening, our first conversation in association with the exhibition. And I want to offer my sincerest thanks to our exhibition sponsors. A major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities supported the exhibition, and the national presenting sponsor is the Henry Luce Foundation. Supporting sponsors include the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, Milwaukee Art Museum's American Art Society, and the Tourist Office of Spain in Chicago. Our contributing sponsors are Christie's and the Gladys Kriebel Delmas Foundation. I also want to extend a special thanks to the American Art Society for their support in making possible this evening's program, as well as all the educational programming for the exhibition. And I hope that you'll join us for our next conversation in this series with scholars Richard Kagan and Mariana Shreve-Simpson on Thursday, July 29th at 5:30 p.m. But tonight you are in for a very special treat, because not only is this the inaugural presentation in conjunction with the exhibition Americans in Spain, and on one of the artists most present in the exhibition and so influenced by the country, John Singer Sargent, but it also acts as a preview of an exhibition about the artist that takes a deep dive into his relationship with Spain. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Sarah Cash. Sarah is an associate curator of American and British paintings at the National Gallery of Art. And before this, she served as the Beckhofer Curator of American Art at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, where in 2011, she completed the first modern scholarly catalog of the Corcoran's American Paintings collection. And prior to arriving at the Corcoran, Cash directed the Meyer Museum of Art at Randolph College, and previously was assistant curator at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Cash received an MA from Williams College graduate program in the history of art and a BA in art history from Smith College. And she is a graduate of the Museum Management Institute in 1996 and the Center for Curatorial Leadership in 2014. And on a personal note, and I know for those of you who have been joining us for many of the programs, including the opening of Americans in Spain, you are beginning to appreciate the personal reveals I give during these moments. But on a personal note, I am even more thrilled to have Sarah join us this evening because of our shared pandemic stories and Spain. The last time I traveled internationally was to Spain in March of 2020 to finalize loans, research threads, and to begin color proofing for the catalog. And Sarah was there doing research for her Sargent and Spain project, which she'll be presenting on this evening. And I had the great pleasure of spending 3 days in Granada with Sarah, visiting sites and exchanging ideas. If the pandemic had to happen and the world locked down, I can think of no better memory than that on which to have it ended. So with that, please give a virtual thumbs up or applause and join me in welcoming Sarah Cash as she discusses Sargent and Spain.
Good evening. I am thrilled to be in this virtual space with you for the next hour. But before I begin my lecture, I want to thank Brandon Rood so much for the invitation to speak today. And indeed, that was a memorable kind of coincidental visit that we had in Granada for those 3 days. I think we all can remember where we were just before the world shut down in the middle of March last year. And Brandon said it very well about our time together in Granada. I want also to thank China Bounds for her assistance with various aspects of this program. And I want to congratulate Brandon and our colleague Corey Piper at the Chrysler Museum for the exhibition. I was fortunate to be able to see Americans in Spain at the Chrysler in April and to be greeted by Corey. The exhibition and the book are visually stunning, as many of you know, and there's so much food for thought in it for both for me as I continue to plan the National Gallery's exhibition, publication, and related materials. So this evening, as you know, I will give you a sneak preview of an exhibition organized by the National Gallery of Art to open in October 2022 called Sargent in Spain. The exhibition will travel to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco from February to May 2023. So I hope that you'll be able to see it at one of its venues. I also want to acknowledge my co-curators, Richard Ormond and Elaine Kilmurray, both esteemed Sargent scholars and co-directors of the 9-volume catalog raisonné, complete catalog, of the artist's paintings, which is an enormous undertaking, and no one's scholarship on Sargent can succeed without relying on that very important publication. Planning an exhibition in all of its complex aspects, especially largely during a pandemic, as Brandon and so many other curators can attest, is truly an undertaking that requires multiple villages, as it were. So as you look at these two very different images of Sargent, one, his diploma self-portrait for the National Academy of Design, he's wearing this wonderful artist's cap, and the other, a very atmospheric photograph from a few decades later. I'll give you a little bit of background on the artist. He was born in 1956 in Florence to expatriate American parents, Fitzwilliam and Mary Sargent. Fitzwilliam was a successful eye surgeon in Philadelphia, and Mary was an amateur artist. The nomadic family moved with the seasons, visiting Northern European locales in the summer months, and Southern ones in the colder periods. They encouraged Sargent's artistic training, first in Florence and then in Paris. Sargent, as I mentioned, was born in Florence on a sort of stopover in that city. And more about his training in a few minutes. The family, as Richard Ormond likes to say, left Philadelphia, went to Europe, and forgot to go home. They spent the rest of their lives, Sargent's parents, in Europe, traveling around, as of course he did. And he lived as an adult during his artistic career, first in Paris and then in London. You might be familiar, many of you are probably familiar with Sargent's, we'll call them society portraits, because that is what they are, and including the great portrait of Madame X or Madame Pierre Gautreau at the Metropolitan and the Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. These are probably familiar images to you. The National Gallery has a wealth of an embarrassment of riches in terms of Sargent portraits. The two full-length portraits came to the collection from the Corcoran Gallery, where I was curator of American art for quite some time, and the other two were already in the National Gallery's collection, so to speak. Sargent made his name, really, painting portraits such as these, Madame Peyron at the far left, done when he was just 23 years old, just having finished his artistic training, Mrs. Henry White a few years later. You may also think of his masterful watercolors, such as the two at the top of Venice, very well known for watercolors of Venice and other places, or his, we'll call them figure paintings or subject paintings, like the two at the bottom. All of these works, again, are in the National Gallery's collection. And it is an honor to be able to work with this collection and think about it. En route pour la pêche, or setting out to fish, at the bottom right from the Corcoran collection, was the basis of an exhibition I organized in 2009, 2010 about John Singer Sargent and his love for the sea. Probably less well known to most of you is Sargent's work in Spain, although of course it's known to you to some degree, I'm sure, through seeing the Americans in Spain exhibition and looking at the wonderful, reading the wonderful catalog. But as Brandon said, this exhibition that I'm working on will take a deep dive into Sargent's work in Spain, which is fascinating, and even many people who are art historians and museum people don't associate him with Spain, with very few exceptions, you'll see in a moment. So he traveled to Spain 7 times over the course of 6 different years, beginning in 1879, finally there in 1912. And you can see that he traveled all over, out of the center of the country, Madrid, to places not very far away, also to the far south of Spain, Andalusia, Granada, Sevilla, Ronda, to the far northwest of Spain, Santiago de Compostela, even to Camprodon, which is over here, which is a very difficult place to get to, very mountainous. And in 1908, Sargent made 2 trips to Mallorca, here. As a colleague of mine said earlier today, good, now I can figure out where Mallorca is. And there it is. So the exhibition will be organized into about 6 sections to illuminate Sargent's work over the course of those 7 trips to Spain. It will open with a focus on art and artists, which is not necessarily the title of that section, but it will illuminate Sargent's, primarily his first visit to Spain in 1879. And Sargent, as I mentioned, was very encouraged by his parents to study art, and did so first in Florence, later in Paris, in the atelier, the studio of this man, Carolus Duran, Sargent's friend, his teacher, his mentor, this fantastic portrait. Everything I show you, by the way, this evening will be by Sargent, unless otherwise specified, just to make that clear. Sargent painted this portrait of his teacher when he was 23 years old, just finishing up his study in Paris, which is, every time I look at this painting, and I saw it in Williamstown, Massachusetts about 3 weeks ago, I'm just stunned at what such a young artist was able to accomplish, even at this tender age of 23. Well, after Sargent finished studying with Carolus Duran in Paris, Carolus Duran said to Sargent, now go to Madrid and study Velázquez, Velázquez, and Velázquez. Could not have been more emphatic about it. And Sargent, being the good student that he was, obedient student, packed his bags and went to Madrid and lived in a boarding house, rented rooms in a boarding house, and spent quite a bit of time at the Prado, as you will know from Brandon's excellent exhibition. And he spent days at a time, weeks at a time there as a copyist, and made paintings such as these, which we can't really call copies, I don't think. They're made in Sargent's inimitable style. They're riffs on Velázquez, or interpretations of Velázquez, including Sargent's own version of Velázquez's most famous painting, Las Meninas. And the painting on the right is a tiny little painting of after a painting in the Prado. So they varied in size and scale. I'm showing you a page from the copyist register at the Prado, which indicates the time that Sargent spent there. So this is not Sargent's handwriting. This is someone, sort of a scribe or a guard person signing Sargent in. So we see the date that he traveled or that he was at the Prado. This is October 1879. The size of his canvas, 50 by 40 centimeters, I think. Prince Balthazar. And so you can see the painting sort of matching up, and he would go back day after day. We at Milwaukee Art Museum, I'm sure we do this at the National Gallery of Art too. People come to learn from paintings in our galleries, and they're able to fill out a form and come work and study as artists. Two more paintings. Actually, the work on the left will be familiar to you from Americans in Spain. So Sargent made full-size, full-scale versions of Velázquez paintings, like the one at the left, or after Velázquez. It was given to Velázquez in Sargent's day. The original was. Now it's believed to be Circle of Velázquez. And then also chose sometimes to alter the format and size of these paintings. The incredible head of Aesop that you see at the right is obviously a head and shoulders, but the full length Velázquez of Aesop in the Prado, Sargent, I think, came face to face with that amazing painting and decided he really wanted to focus on the incredible face of Aesop in Velázquez's painting. All of those sort of lights and darks, and the painting of Aesop's skin. Velázquez was considered something of a proto-modernist to painters like Sargent, Manet, and others, as you again will learn in the Milwaukee exhibition, and very much revered by Sargent and others with his loose brushwork, amazing command of light and darks and tonal values. I'm always amazed when I go to the Prado. These are the Velázquez paintings are so very modern. Sargent loved these works. Mostly they were for him to keep and sort of inspire himself in his studio. So you can see actually in these two photos of Sargent in his Paris studio, there's Sargent, but the Hispanic Society painting is just here. And this painting from Ireland is hanging here, if you can see where my cursor is. So these were, and there's a copy of a Hall's painting, Franz Hall's painting, for example. And in this image, you see the so-called dwarf with dog here in the photograph. So he again, thought about Velázquez throughout his career and kept these paintings so he could look at them and remind himself, I think, of his very young days as an artist in Madrid. He also revered artists like El Greco, sorry for a little noise in the background, and saw quite a bit of El Greco's work in Spain, in Madrid, and in Toledo, and actually collected this painting after, which is not by El Greco, we'll call it Circle of El Greco, that Sargent probably bought in Paris around 1900. And I think he knew it was not by El Greco, but he loved it, and he gave it pride of place over his fireplace in his studio in London, where he moved, by the way. I forgot to tell you, but after the sort of scandal with the portrait of Madame X, when Sargent showed that publicly, and it was thought to be so scandalous in Paris, it was quite a, shall we say, career changer for him. And he left not long after that, in the mid-1880s. Sargent moved to London to sort of restart his career. So then his studio was on Tite Street in Chelsea. You can still see the building today. I should say that the original El Greco of St. Martin and the Beggar is actually in the National Gallery of Art's collection, the painting that inspired the painting on the left. So we'll have some nice connections for people who come to see the exhibition to see that painting, and we'll actually include that in the exhibition, the El Greco. Goya was another Spanish artist that Sargent revered on this first trip and for a long time afterward. Went outside of the historical center of Madrid to copy or interpret a fantastic mural cycle in a little church called St. Anthony of Florida, a little bit on the outskirts of Madrid, not the outskirts, but on the outskirts of the historical center, and chose to paint just a tiny corner of these murals, it's a very small square church. I highly recommend to you. It's where Goya is buried, actually. And Sargent at this time, these several years in the late 1870s, was using mahogany panels, very thin mahogany panels. You can see the wood showing through here, and he would carry them in a travel box with slots. And you could just carry the box with him, make a quick study on a panel, put it in the slotted box, and go on his way, not having to worry about placing something on top of wet paint on a panel. These two paintings, while clearly not Spain, very much show the influence on Velázquez, of Velázquez on Sargent. For example, the painting made in Venice in the early 1880s is very much indebted to Velázquez. The darks and lights, the great recession of space almost makes you think of Las Meninas, and the command of tonal values, and full-length portraits like the wonderful Cecil Harrison at the left against very dramatic but rather empty backgrounds, very characteristic of Velázquez and something that Sargent loved and carried through his career. The second section of the exhibition will address Sargent's absolute fascination with dance and music, specifically flamenco, in Sevilla and Granada. The painting on the left is probably familiar to many of you Sargent fans. Sargent's masterpiece, executed in his Paris studio. It's so large, you probably know. It's, I think it's something like 10 by 18 feet. I don't have the exact dimensions in my head. The size of a wall, and it is on a wall at the Gardner Museum. And Sargent created it in his Paris studio, but is based on sketches that he made on site in Sevilla and Granada of flamenco dancers and musicians. The model for this painting was a Parisian model that Sargent painted and drew when he was back in his studio in Paris, probably the same model for the full-length painting at the right. So these works, sadly, we will not be able to include El Jaleo in the exhibition. I'm very, very sad about that. We will have part of the exhibition that will interpret the painting, show good reproductions of it, and show quite a few of the studies that Sargent made for it. So we'll be able to represent it in a different kind of way. Brandon knows well the challenge of getting loans for exhibitions. It's one of the hardest things curators do. But that's not to say that you won't be able to see many other amazing Sargent paintings of the dance, like the three works on the screen. Watercolor at the left, which is actually a study for the painting at the right, Spanish Dancer, and two images of dancers on the right, very similar, but quite different in palettes. And the painting on the right of the Roma dancer has wonderful inscriptions. Sargent inscribed it to his friend Chabrier, a composer, but we also see ole, ole, jaleo, ole. So we have the sense of sound as well as movement, these wonderful works that Sargent made, again, in probably in Sevilla or Granada. We'll have a number of incredible drawings from sketchbooks at the Gardner Museum that Sargent gave to Isabella Stewart Gardner, sketchbooks that contain these very lively studies for El Jaleo. And I'm including the wonderful drawing that's in your own collection and in the exhibition at the far right here. So you can kind of see a grouping of Sargent's studies of dancers. I happen to adore the study in the center where you're just looking at Sargent painting a raised arm again and again and again, trying to get the position of the dancers' bodies just right. The Spanish Dance, a painting at the far right that you'll be familiar with related works in the Milwaukee exhibition, is a painting again that Sargent created in his studio in Paris, but made a number of site studies, I feel certain, on that first trip to Spain in 1879, including the drawings that you see on the screen, very different drawings at the upper left, very sort of deliberate, with all of that cross-hatching and the female figure across being held by the male figure, and a great range of things. Dancer at the lower right-hand corner of this page, again, Sargent studying the position of the dancers. In this case, the dancer at the lower right of Spanish dance. We'll include the oil studies that you see on the screen for the Spanish dance as well. So people will, I hope, have a chance to see Sargent's working methods as he created paintings like this. It's hard to know actually what's going on in the finished painting. It's been described as Whistlerian, with sort of fireworks-like lights, these dots of light that are up above. And I wish I could tell you what that is. I mean, I think it's an outdoor scene. I don't actually know if it's supposed to be a starry sky or some sort of fireworks or light show, but I'm open to any ideas. La Carmencita is was a very, very well-known flamenco dancer, Spanish dancer, who you will see this painting in Milwaukee. If you haven't seen the exhibition already, you will see it. Sort of a wondrous painting by Sargent that is in Paris, and I'm always delighted to be able to see this painting. I'll give a little plug here for an exhibition that's coming to Boston in 2023. I think it's 2023, about Sargent and fashion. And it will be at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Tate in London. And Brandon's and my wonderful colleague, Erica Hirschler, is curating this exhibition with a costume curator at the MFA Boston. And believe it or not, this amazing dress worn by Carmencita exists, and you'll be able to see this painting with her dress, as well as a number of other pieces of clothing that Sargent had. Quite often, I mean, this dress belonged to Carmencita, but quite often Sargent would travel around with a trunk of hats and clothes and shawls that he would suggest that his portrait sitters put on for their portraits. That's another topic. In addition to that formal, very life-size portrait of La Carmencita, we will have in the exhibition the opportunity to see sort of different depictions of La Carmencita, this very unusual, interesting painting at the right, clearly Sargent showing La Carmencita in the act of dancing. I always think of her, the sort of fringe here as sort of bird's wings, or, he's really trying to show her in motion, which is fabulous, which you also get the sense of from one of the studies for La Carmencita dancing that you see at the center, this flurry of quick pencil strokes, just creating her body and her pose. Not long ago, I discovered, it was new to me, the postcard at the left. In the early part of the 20th century, you could send your film away and have it developed on postcard stock. These were called real photo postcards and became popular in about the first decade of the 20th century. Well, that, by the way, is not Sargent's handwriting, but I do think there's a very strong possibility that on his final trip to Spain, Sargent took the photograph that you see of the dancers dancing outdoors. And there are several other photographs that came back with Sargent from that trip. In fact, when he returned from that trip, he wrote to a friend saying, "I've done many oils, not too many watercolors, and I'm bringing back a lot of photographs," which is a very intriguing statement. And I believe that to be one of the photographs that he probably took and brought back to London at that point when he was living in London. The next section of the exhibition will be about architecture and gardens. Those of you who know Sargent's work know that he loved all manner of architecture, especially Renaissance architecture and gardens. But in Spain, he had the opportunity to paint not only Renaissance architecture, but also the architecture of Andalusi architecture, of the Alhambra, for example. These two quite different views. Not only are they different parts of the Alhambra, of course, they are different, very different in paint handling. The one on the right from Sargent's first trip to Spain, very sort of impressionistic. I've been writing about this painting this week. I'm thinking a lot about the sort of very blurry brushstrokes here at the lower left, and what that means for the painting, and just this sliver of blue sky at the upper right, and the reflection of the arches in the reflecting pool, and also the recession of space that we see going back through the arch. The painting on the left from a later trip to Spain, we believe, because actually Sargent mentioned painting a painting of the Alhambra in 1895, and my colleagues, Richard Ormond and Elaine Kilmurray, who are the arbiters of dating of Sargent, believe that this is that painting, the painting on the left, based on stylistic analysis and the fact that we know that Sargent wrote about painting the Alhambra on that trip. I'm showing you the great Sorolla that is in the exhibition in Milwaukee, which I just loved seeing when I was in Norfolk. Here with the Sargent of the same subject, and they make a wonderful comparison. The little dome here is no longer, that was a much later addition, as you can probably tell, to this building. It's no longer there. But what a great pair they make it here, at least digitally, this comparison. They were friends, by the way, as you probably know from Brandon's exhibition. Sargent was a great admirer of Sorolla and vice versa. Very much one of the contemporary or modern Spanish painters that influenced Sargent. It was not just the Spanish masters of the 17th century, but it was artists like Sorolla, Zuelaja, some of the artists that you will see in the Milwaukee exhibition and referred to in the catalog for that show. He was quite friendly with a number of artists. I almost hesitate to show Sargent's watercolor at the left with my surreptitious photograph from my trip last year on the right of the very famous vase of the gazelles from the 14th century. The Nasrid period in the Alhambra, a fantastic, amazing object, which, by the way, is, I'm thinking it's probably 10 to 12 feet tall. It is enormous, and was at the Alhambra for a very, well, still is there, but was on view, not in a museum where it is now, but on the site of the Alhambra for a very long time. And Sargent's remarkable detailed watercolor of this vase as if it's sort of floating in space, which is kind of a wonderful thing to me. It seems very ethereal. I mean, the object itself, although it probably weighs a ton, is very ethereal. And Sargent's watercolor really brings that to the fore. In fact, it's so interesting to me to look at these two together, the watercolor of the wellhead on the right that he made in Toledo in a little archaeological museum there that we know quite a bit about, are really the two, as far as I can tell, Sargent's only depictions of archaeological objects in his whole career. He did depict, of course, sculptures and statues, but most of them attached to architecture. There may be a few that he made in Italy of statues in Rome, for example, but no objects of this type. In fact, he loved painting objects. He loved painting objects and people, and more about that in a little bit. On his trip to a later trip to Toledo, it's interesting about the dating. This is circa 1902. I actually think it's it should date from about 1903. Sargent went to this church a little bit, again, on the outskirts of the historical center of Toledo, to paint the interior of this church, this cathedral, called the Chapel of the New Kings. And to refer back to my comment about photographs, the photograph that you see on the right, which obviously depicts the Berruguete tomb sculpture that you see in Sargent's watercolor. The photo on the right was one of about 600 photographs of its type, commercially produced photographs that you could buy in a shop, that Sargent owned, that were given by his sisters to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And that has been a sort of wellspring of a great cache of information and images. And they've only just been cataloged by the Victoria and Albert Museum within the last few years, fully cataloged, that is. When they were given in the 1920s by Sargent's sisters after his death, they were dispersed to the far corners of the museum. Now that they've been brought together by a wonderful colleague of mine, we're learning so much more about what Sargent collected. And there are about 200 of them that depict Spanish sites that he kept clearly in his studio because he was so interested, sort of aide memoire that he held on to. On his 1912, his final trip to Spain, Sargent actually didn't paint so much at the Alhambra, but more in the Generalife Palace and Gardens, as you see at the left. And again, the subject of photography comes up. Sargent, or one of his traveling companions, made the glass stereograph that you see at the upper right on this trip in 1912. It belongs to a descendant of Sargent's travel companion. I'm sure many of you are familiar with stereographs. You put them in a viewer, like you see at the lower right, and the images come together as if they're three-dimensional. The pièce de résistance, of course, Sargent's final trip, is this watercolor of the escutcheon of Charles V. I remember actually the evening in March of last year when Brandon and I were walking by this very fountain. And I'm thinking a lot about this watercolor because I'm wondering if Sargent, it would have taken him a long time to execute this watercolor. It's drawn very carefully with pencil, with a compass actually, to draw that half circle at the top. And the idea of sunlight just flickering across this is just a masterpiece. But one wonders, it must have taken him hours. Even Sargent, it took him many hours. So I'm wondering if he, made drawings. I'm wondering if even maybe was looking at a photograph to help him capture that light across the surface. Another photograph that Sargent brought back from his final trip to Spain on the right, of a fountain that you see in his watercolor at the left. I'm not saying that Sargent sort of cut off the top of the fountain sculpture because it was related to a photograph, because it was a very common thing for Sargent to do anyway. He loved these cropped views or unusual angles. But to me, it's very interesting to think about him creating, actually, in all these different media on his final trip. Two fountains at Aranjuez, one of the royal palaces just outside of Madrid, one in watercolor and one in oil. Again, Sargent chopping the legs of this sculpture off right at the knee here. And here, the sculpture is really just a blur. It's such an interesting comparison. Landscape and people, I will try and move quickly through these last slides. Sargent said at one point, quite famously, "I don't like to paint air and open landscape." So the painting at the left, with its panoramic view of the Sierra Nevada mountains, made in Granada, is really quite unusual for him. And I've seen it actually in Cardiff, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in the context of the rest of the exhibition. It's related somewhat to the landscape on the right, which we cannot borrow because the National Museum of Asian Art does not, formerly the Freer Sackler, does not lend, but we're hoping to do some programming with them. You will recognize the painting on the left in the Milwaukee exhibition. Huge thanks to Brandon for identifying the site depicted in this painting, which is really very illuminating, and I had the chance to visit the site when we were in Granada last year. And Sargent, even in 1879, on his trip to Granada, I think he was painting the same site that you see at the right, with the sort of random, very, you know, where did this come from, Turkey in an odd scale at the lower right, again painted on one of those thin mahogany panels. Sargent was a huge lover of animals and really of people, and really just embraced, I think, getting to paint very working people and animals. Cuenca is a site a little bit east of Madrid, very famous for the houses hanging off of cliffs there, but Sargent seems to have ignored that completely and visited the interior of the stable with the person taking care of the animals, the donkeys. And at the right, we feel as if we are in Sargent's seat. We see the hood of the carriage cover here, and man holding on to horses. So really have this feeling that you are the artist. You are right where he's sitting, painting this watercolor. Many works that have rarely been seen in Sargent exhibitions will be included in this show, which I'm very excited about, including this one, including the one at the left, which is coming from Australia. And I don't believe it's ever been seen outside of Australia since it was acquired by that museum in the late 19th century. Again, a really interesting subject, and I'm very curious about how Sargent sought out this hospital for indigents in Granada, and why he decided to paint this subject. Likewise, he sought out a hospital in Santiago de Compostela and depicted the soldiers that we see here at the right on a different trip. And again on his final trip to Spain, I believe this was done in the Albayzín or the Sacromonte neighborhood in Granada, across from the Alhambra, where Sargent is painting a family, a Spanish Roma family, extended family, probably in front of their dwelling, their cave. Historically, this is where the Roma people have made their homes. In Granada and also in Guadix and other parts of Andalusia. It's a fantastic image of people very busy with their work, a woman weaving this fantastic kind of spiral of brushwork, a man checking the teeth of a donkey, blue pigs, which are famous in Andalusia and a delicacy, the ham from the pigs, an older woman tending to a young baby, this toddler kind of tied to a chair in a sort of makeshift toddler seat. Showing also the Sargent's interest in light and pattern. Think of the little bit of blue that we saw in that painting of the Alhambra, and here it shows up in the background of this painting, the blue sky. A quick note about a project I've been working on in conjunction with this exhibition, which we've called the Roma People Conversation Group. Several internal people at the National Gallery and 6 people who are experts on the history and issues relating to the Roma people, people that would at one time have been called gypsies, but no longer. So there are 3 people from Spain that were part of the group, 3 people from the US, one of them, and 3 Roma people, 2 Spanish Roma people and a Roma person from Romania, to talk about the issues confronting the Roma people and what words to use, what interpretive texts to use when talking about the Spanish Roma people, because gypsy is thought to be quite offensive and is no longer used or should not be used anymore in common language. So you can see from just the next couple of slides that we're planning to request from lenders that we can use different titles for their paintings, so we do not have to use the word gypsy. We at the National Gallery, like so many museums today, aim to be inclusive and empathetic, and really thinking very hard about words that we use. So the man on the right was a tourist attraction in Granada. Instead of calling him the King of the Gypsies in French, Le Roi des Gitanes, we will probably call him Mariano Fernandez, which was his name. So a lot of this work is going into our research. Photograph that Sargent owned. He had several scrapbooks, including photographs and stencils that he drew actually when he was at the Alhambra. He was always working, always collecting, really incredible amount of work. Mallorca, the island that you see here, a few images of family that Sargent made, his sister Emily Sargent in the painting at the left, and their friend Eliza Wedgwood under these self-fashioned mosquito nets at the villa that they were renting while they were in Mallorca, and the two women sketching in the landscape. But also Sargent, of course, turned his attention to the incredible coastal views, views down into ports like you see on the right, the brilliant, brilliant watercolor of Mallorca at the left on this 1908 trip, but also focused on working people and working boats. This fisherman with swagger at the left, a painting that's hardly ever been seen in public, watercolors in primarily the port of Sawyer and Palma in Mallorca. Women working in a courtyard, washing, stripping maize, washing clothes, stripping maize, little girl with a doll, washing clothes in a giant well. Sargent's so interested in the work of the people that he encountered. Our painting at the National Gallery, very interesting, large painting, abstract painting. Sargent surely finished it in his studio. But there's, as you can see, no horizon line, no, it's almost as if we are up in this abstract piece of foliage. Excuse me, thistles and herbage on a hillside. Likewise, with these paintings in oil and watercolor of, as you can see, figs, gourds, and pomegranates, remarkable works, only a few of which I've seen because of the pandemic. I had to stop my travel to see private collections, but these will be in the exhibition. They figure also into the final section of the exhibition because Sargent was not only sort of thinking very much about these remarkable mixes of still life and landscape, which is how I think of the three works at the lower corner. But he was also thinking so much about the murals that he was working on for the Boston Public Library and the decoration. So the gourds he was painting, and he was thinking about placing eventually the gourd there at the top center, the pomegranates, and the fig leaves here that you see. So he had kind of dual purpose in this trip. Well, in a number of trips after 1890 when he began working on these murals, which you can see. And I, now that we can maybe travel a little more again, if you have not been to the Boston Public Library and seen Sargent's murals, there are also murals by Puvis de Chabannes on another floor. It is a masterpiece of architecture and mural painting. Highly encourage you to visit. Sargent, when working on the murals, visited Madrid again, began to think a lot more about perspective and paintings over one's head, foreshortening, and made this painting after El Greco in 1895. And again, remarkable watercolors. He was thinking about the Madonna figures and Christ figures and all of the incredible religious altarpieces in the churches, particularly in southern Spain. In Granada is where these three watercolors were painted. And thinking about figures on architecture, sculptures on architecture, and also the photos that he collected that are mentioned that are in the V&A Museum. We can see actually him thinking about crucifixes and drawing studies for the crucifixion in these two, I'm showing you two different parts of the Boston Public Library murals. We, of course, are not borrowing them for the exhibition, but we will show them to indicate Sargent's very strong interest in drawing and painting religious sculpture and art in southern Spain, and how it influenced his conception of these murals. Last but not least, to me, it's interesting to see photos again that Sargent collected, watercolors that he made that that were very close to some of the photographs that he collected, and how he's kind of taking all this raw material and putting it together and creating these mural panels. And the sculpture at the bottom center is actually one that he owned, which I encountered in the home of one of the descendants of Sargent a couple of years ago. And I saw it and I thought, what is that and where did it come from? Turns out it was in his collection originally. And I began to think more about the other images that you see on the screen, and how Sargent probably collected, and he thought about it, he looked at it, and I'm not saying he copied it, but all these pieces of inspiration figured into the murals. And the exhibition will close with that section. And I think I've already taken up far more time than I should have been allotted, but thank you.
No, thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that guided tour of John Singer Sargent's Spain. And we have been having some really great questions been coming in while you've been speaking and sharing your knowledge. And I am going to start with some of those, and begging forgiveness from the audience, go a little bit out of order, because they apply to some of the things that Sarah and I had been discussing, and also admittedly a question of my own. And so I'm going to start with Kaz Young, who wrote that while I understand that studies of other artists' work aren't necessarily copies, I am curious about this. Can you elaborate on why and how often these studies were done? Parenthetically, it seems that there was no shortage of original output from Sargent and other artists that engaged in this practice. And I'm also curious about this because, as you discussed, copies play a critical role in both of our exhibitions. Certainly these artists, from Robert Henry to Robert Frederick Bloom to John Singer Sargent himself, inspired to visit the Prado, use these as educational exercises for training. And I'm really struck by your comment about, you said riffs on Velázquez. Because going through the Americans in Spain exhibition, working with that material, we have a great full-length Aesop by William Merritt Chase, then next to the bust length of Aesop by Sargent. And you really do see so much of Sargent in the Aesop, and less so of Chase. And so they were using them for a variety of reasons, as models, as inspiration in their studios. But I was also curious about the objects, the Alhambra vase, the wellhead with the Kufic inscriptions that you showed, some of the architectural details. So going back to Kaz's question, and then also your comments, do you think an attraction to making these copies, whether it is an object, whether it is after a famous painting, and what would be the reason in some of these individual cases? And that's a lot, and I'm happy to go back.
So let me, I guess, try to distill. I mean, thinking about why artists like Sargent would have made the copies in the Prado, and how much time they spent there.
Yeah, Kaz's question specifically was, can you elaborate on why and how often these studies were done?
Okay. Well, I think you touched on a little bit of that, Brandon. I mean, artists who well, how often Sargent, I can tell you, and as you probably know, was at the Prado for, we don't know, a month or so in the fall of 1879, and he would go back again and again. Um, and I think he intended to really just make a strong study of these paintings that inspired him so much. I want to make sure I'm clear that uh, I'm working so much on Spain, but Sargent, soon after that, he went off to Amsterdam, I think, and made copies after, he made copies after some of the Northern painters, after Frans Hals, for example. So this is not an isolated example that he was in Madrid at the Prado. But again, I think they're, to me anyway, they're very personal. They're as you say, they're exercises normally for an artist to copy after or to paint after artists that they admire. And the fact that Sargent kept so many of these in his studio, and the painting of Las Meninas, he kept his entire, most of them, I think, he kept his entire life as works that he could refer back to. If that's helpful. I think the watercolors of the objects of the vase and the wellhead are very different. Those are, him showing his skill at watercolor and what he can render, and his interest in decorative design and the decorative design of the Andalusi, of the objects that he saw. So, and that continued, I should say, if you look at the still life or the fruit and foliage studies that he made in Mallorca, I mean, in a sense, those are decorative in a very different way. And then he's kind of, I think, taking all that incredible interest in decoration and pattern and bringing it to, for example, the edges, the borders of the murals in Boston. So there's a whole other object that he didn't show because we can't borrow it, but we're hoping to show it digitally. An enormous scrapbook in Harvard's collection, that shows stencil after stencil and drawing after drawing of stucco and tile in the Alhambra and photos of the Alhambra that he collected. So it's almost an obsession with these decorative elements. So I kind of think of those as different things than the works in the Prado, if that helps.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And I think that's also a nice segue, I think, going a little bit out of order, from a question from Bernie Newman about the extent of the photographs and how they played a role in Sargent's work.
Mm-hmm. That's something I'm thinking a lot about. Thank you. And I want to point out, though I'm thinking and writing about Sargent all the time, the photographs, it's not necessarily a brand new thing that Sargent made some photographs and collected photographs, although the photographs at the V&A, that literally has been a sort of rediscovery, as you know, Brandon, in the last, thinking 6 or 7 years. But the smaller, and those are, I'm going to say most of them are about the size of a laptop. Those are, because you have some in the exhibition of that type. But the stereographs and the photo postcards and the smaller photographs, Sargent, we do know that he was interested in photography in Italy, and there are photographs that he brought back from his travels to Italy as well that he probably took. But I'm interested because they've never really been studied. This group has never really been studied, except for a tiny bit in the Catalogue Raisonné, to kind of elaborate and contextualize Sargent's work in Spain. He did later in his life own a large stereo viewer, and actually the collection of the descendants of one of his travel companions, I'm supposed to go visit this fall in the UK, and she has hundreds of photographs and a camera that belonged to Sargent, and no one has ever seen these things before. So I'm going to go and take a deep breath and go through these boxes of photographs and see what's there. That's the kind of thing that, it's an exciting thing for curators when you hear about boxes and boxes of photographs that probably came back from a trip that Sargent was on, and you think, well, wait a minute, I need to go see those and sort through them. So, long answer to your question, Sargent, like many other artists of that period, of course, were interested in photography. To me, it's just interesting to hear or to think about him again, creating in those different modes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm going to build a bridge between two different questions that came in. One was actually the initial from Maya Jursic. I hope I pronounced that right, Maya. And only because, of course, it's such a great story. And that was, why was the Madame X painting considered so scandalous? But then that also builds a great bridge to Calvin Bressman's question about Sargent's time in Spain contributing to the development of his mature style. He's architecturally focused in his question on the watercolors, which he says seem to emphasize values created by sunlight and shadow versus more adolescent watercolor style, which seems to be closer to the English school of Turner. So combining the questions, I'm going back to Madame X, which of course was a fairly youthful painting, and in the development of Spain on his mature style, especially vis-a-vis the watercolors.
So yes, Madame X, she was exhibited actually next to the National Gallery's great painting of Mrs. Henry White that I showed early in the lecture that came from the Corcoran collection. So you had this, full-length portrait of a woman décolleté in this black dress, and then Mrs. White all covered up in her white dress. It must have been an amazing sight. He had them both in the studio at the same time. Madame X, Sargent showed Madame X for the first time publicly with her, one of her dress straps dropped down to the shoulder. And that was what was thought to be so scandalous. There are other things I should have our colleague Stephanie Herdrick from the Met talk to us about Madame X, because it's such a fascinating and complicated story. But suffice it to say that there are a lot of factors, but I think that was the main one that went into the critics thinking about Madame X as so scandalous. Sargent later painted the strap up on the shoulder, but if I'm remembering correctly, the damage was done, as it were, to his time in Paris. So a little bit of I think the observation about, and I think we could have probably see on many of his full-length portraits, the influence of Velázquez, probably also in Madame X and the Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, which is so much like Las Meninas in many ways. The issue of the watercolors, that's a really wonderful observation about his early watercolors and the tonal values, and perhaps some of the later ones with more dramatic differences between light and dark. And I think that's very well stated. And certainly, if you look at the Venetian watercolors, of which there are many, many, many more, I think, than the watercolors that he made in Spain, you sort of see that development. But that's a wonderful observation about the sort of more tonal nature of the early watercolors. So thank you.
And then I'm going to also build a bridge or attempt to between two additional questions, both pertaining to Sargent's religious work or copies of religious implements or details or architecture. And the first is from George Affeldt. Is there any work of the 13th century cathedral at Fleet Landing, Palma, Mallorca? He remembers it well from Liberty from his U.S. Navy ship employment.
Mm.
And then from Sharon Blattner-Held, regarding the Madonna figure you were asking about, origin looks very much like a similar figures collected by Sorolla when she visited the Sorolla Museum in Madrid. So any comments on specifics about the cathedral or the Madonna figures that either Sargent painted or knew about?
Oh, such wonderful questions and observations. I believe that the cathedral in Palma that is part of the question is the main cathedral in Palma, I think. Of course, I can't ask the person who's asking the question, but Sargent, yes, the answer is yes. The enormous cathedral that you see from the water. My potential trip to Mallorca was canceled because of the pandemic, and and it actually appears in the background of one of the watercolors of the port. I don't think it's in one of the ones that I showed, but another one that we're borrowing for the exhibition shows the cathedral in the background. And then Sargent also made a very small watercolor or watercolor of a very small architectural detail of that cathedral. So it's wonderful that the person who asked the question has a personal memory of that spot. The question about the sculptures in Sorolla's collection, thank you to the person who asked that question, because I've been several times to the Sorolla Museum. It's amazing in Madrid and a little bit off the beaten path, so highly recommend it to everyone. Because the studio is there and everything is there. We're borrowing from them actually a watercolor that Sargent gave to Sorolla, which I did not show. But I'm going to have to follow up, and I want to thank the questioner for that, to think more about the religious objects that Sorolla collected. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you. And since we are over our time, and I can't thank Sarah enough for extending it, but things is in advance because I'm going to ask one more question. But I'm also going to try to build a bridge between a couple that we just haven't had a chance to get to. One from our own Barbara Fuller asks, relating, I suppose, to the commissions and the various work he discussed, when was Sargent in America in relation to when he was in Spain? And then on top of that, Kelly Turdo, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you, Kelly. Sargent used Spanish-influenced costume. Going back to your discussion of Carmencita and Erica's upcoming exhibition. In some of his society portraits, most notably on the 1913 portrait of Sybil Sassoon, Countess of Roxavage. Will the aspect of this portraiture be addressed? So we're taking multiple avenues here with Sargent's travels between, say, Spain and America, and then his use of Spanish costumes on paintings that were not necessarily done in or of Spanish people.
Wow. Okay.
So sorry to load you down with the.
No, that's okay. I apologize to the audience because I think I spoke for too long and I didn't.
No, not at all.
To foreclose any questions. So Sargent traveled to Spain. He traveled there mostly from Europe. At the 1895 trip, he traveled to Spain from the US, I'm sorry, from the US with his friend, Dr. William White of Philadelphia. So that maybe speaks to the question. The other trips, he was already in Paris or London, depending on which part of his career we're talking about, and traveled to Spain from there. Now, he did come to the US, of course, to paint portraits. His very first trip to this country was in 1876 with his family. before he actually studied in Paris, they went to Philadelphia to see relatives. He and his mother and his sister went to Philadelphia to see relatives. But then, of course, later in his career, came to the US quite a bit to paint portraits in New York, Boston. He passed through Chicago, as we know from an exhibition a couple of years ago. He went to the Rockies. And I went to the Rockies a few years ago, and I thought, oh my God, it's incredible that Sargent painted in the Rockies in this country. So, and of course, after 1890, when he received the commission for the Boston murals, he came back and forth well, I mean, for his time, we could call it a fair amount to work on those murals. And also murals at Harvard, murals at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So there are other mural cycles that he worked on. As far as I'm not sure I can help with the question about costume and clothing, but I'd love to hear more about that. Sargent, maybe briefly, I can say that he, again, quite often, I mean, when he came back from Spain, I think on the first trip, he brought back hats, he brought back shawls. We know that because they appear in some drawings and oils that we think he did in the studio. So there are figures dressed in Spanish shawls and hats that he brought back with him. And as for the specific portrait mentioned, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I can say that the exhibition in Boston, London was very illuminating as far as Sargent's interest in clothing and costume and how he interacted with his portrait subjects on that topic.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And one final one, but no question, from Rachel Aird. She just said, I want to thank ma'am for bringing Sarah for this incredible lecture. Thanks for sharing your expertise. I enjoyed learning new things.
Oh.
And I could not have said it better myself. So thank you so much, Sarah, and for being a trooper and allowing me to bombard you with questions.
No, happy to have all the questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at the next lecture in the series. So again, please give a virtual applause and thumbs up to Sarah Cash. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you all for listening and your patience. I wish I could see all your faces, but it's always great and your questions were fantastic. Thank you for having me.